first war, and that's my first book, The Domestic Causes of American Wars. The first one is the quasi-war with France. Well, when our country started, and even before that, the French and the British were fighting these wars, and we got caught up with them because our neutral trade, both sides were trying to, prevent our exports from getting to their enemies because they can be used in the war. Even foodstuffs were a war item in many cases. But the quasi-war, I mention this because it was a simple war where the United States had been allied with France during the American Revolution. In fact, it's probably more accurate to say that we helped the French win our independence from Britain. And so we had this alliance, and George Washington, he was a Federalist, but after he became president after the war, after the American Revolution, he sort of became pro-British with Alexander Hamilton. On the other side was Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And it's very interesting because in the quasi-war, the Federalists who were pro-British were in power in the United States. And so they were very concerned about the French poaching our trade. But the French were mad because they felt that we were still allied with the French from after the American Revolution. And yet we just signed this treaty, which was very one-sided with the British, the Jay Treaty. So they started, and it really affected them because they had, the United States was allowing the British to attack their ships, and also providing a shelter in our ports for them. So they started attacking our merchant ships. Well, the only reason I mention this war is because it was the first war we had, and it's the prototype on how the war should have been run. The Congress doesn't have to declare war, and Congress is very nervous about getting involved in France, which was a very powerful country at the time, and we had a new type of government here. They were very nervous about that, so they were very strict. They passed 20 laws. Congress passed 20 laws on ship deployments, rules of engagement, everything. And the reason that they did this shows what the original concept was in America, was that the Congress had to declare war, unlike in Britain, the country that we got our independence from. The monarch had this power. He could declare war. And many of the other European monarchs had this power as well. And they would just declare war, and their populations would suffer in high taxes, and they would also be conscripted to fight in the war, the peasants and the common person. So when the framers framed the Constitution, they said, well, we want the people's houses to initiate war. Now, they changed it to declare war simply because, or at least according to Madison's notes of the Constitutional Convention, they wanted the president to have a power. If we were directly being invaded, the Congress was out most of the year then because of the harvests and everything in the old days. Now the Congress can be reconvened in a moment's notice because of airplanes, cars, whatever. And it sits most of the time, but not back then. So what they did was they said the president needs this power in case we're attacked. He needs to, obviously can't sit there and do nothing. But but Congress is eventually going to have to approve whatever military action he takes, even defensive. But he does have the power to do that. And also, any offensive warfare, that's supposed to be approved by Congress. Well, that was the case with the quasi-war. They limited the activities to only defending our ships rather than attacking French ships. And as I said, the Congress was really involved in the deployments. And that's going to be a key because we don't do that anymore. We assume that, and we're way past that now. In 1950 was when we stopped declaring war. The last declared war that we had was in World War II. And Truman didn't get a declaration of war for a major war. That was a major change. And he, I think, became also the first imperial president because he had all these structures that they put in place in the National Security Act of 1947, which gave him his own intelligence agency. He didn't have to rely on the military. He didn't have to, you had a unified command in the Defense Department. He used to have secretaries of war and Navy, so he had easier to control the military. And he also had a new bureaucracy around the White House, the National Security Council. And so ever since 1950, they kind of thrown all the rules to the wind, and they don't follow the declaration of war. And I think that's one of the things that we would like here at the committee for them to start doing again. I personally think that's not enough. I think we should go back to where the Congress does deployments, controls deployments as well. And I'll go and give another example. This has been abused in the Mexican War, which was in 1946 to 48. And James Polk had a secret plan to conquer half of Mexico, which actually conquered 51% of it. And that's our Southwest California. He wanted the ports in California. But what he did was he took the forces that Texas was just admitted to the Union, annexed. And so he took the forces that were sent down there to protect Texas, because Mexico was still mad about, Texas independence from about 9 years before. And so Polk, what he cleverly did was he took those forces and he put them in disputed territory. And actually the Mexican government had a better case that was their soil than the United States did. And what happened was the Mexicans, he then blockaded this port, which is relevant now since Trump just blockaded the Venezuelans, which has always been internationally an act of war. So actually, many people think Polk provoked the war, but actually started the war by blockading this port on the Rio Grande. And so what happened was Mexicans, they raided in this disputed territory, and Polk said, well, they're attacking us on our own soil, and so he asked for a declaration of war. The Congress, many people were suspicious of this, but they, of course, like Congress always does, they voted for it. And so, of course, he was able to manipulate this. There was a declaration of war, but he had deployed these forces in a very, an area that was prone to hostilities, which any present president can do the same thing, and they often do. We saw that in Vietnam. We saw that in we saw it in the first Gulf War as well, Desert Shield. So they deploy these forces, and then there's a momentum to use the forces. Like the forces would deteriorate, the readiness would deteriorate in the desert and the Desert Storm, Desert Shield. So what happens, they use in Desert Storm. The same is true with these forces that are down in the Caribbean and right now. I mean, military forces, if you leave them on station, even the Navy, the readiness deteriorates. And now maybe there won't be any big action, but I think, when you put forces like that, everybody's expecting something to happen, right? Oh, Trump chickened out. We're going to get the Trump chickened out thing. And so Congress also needs to control these deployments as well, I think. And they're constitutionally, they did it at the beginning of the country, but at the beginning of the history of the country, but they don't do it now. I mean, we've gone so much to, as John mentioned, congressional abdication of power. It hasn't been just the executive stealing power, it's been congressional abdication. War power is not the only thing. We don't do treaties anymore. Treaties require two-thirds Senate approval, and we don't do that. And in the just before the Mexican War, John Tyler set a precedent by the Treaty of Annexation for Texas. Instead of getting two-thirds of the Senate, which the Constitution says, he just said, well, we're going to annex it with a majority in either house. And that set a bad precedent. Now we do executive agreements, which aren't in the Constitution. And they're, who knows? Most of them don't go through Congress. and some of them are secret. So this is an abrogation of the treaty power. The budget, that's the key congressional power, and yet they've abdicated it. Congress still passes the budget occasionally, but well, yeah, the Budget Act is in bad shape, but they're supposed to pass it. But really what happens, even when they pass a budget, they putter around the edges of this massive, and that just, it's just the size of the budget. Nobody knows, as I think David Stockman would agree with this. If anybody in the history of the United States, he probably knew the most about budget. But even he doesn't. He admitted he didn't know all about the budget because it's massive, and the $1 trillion is the defense budget, and that's even massive. So anyway, we go through this thing, and I'm stressing this because the committee is very concerned about this and has been for a long time, that executives can just, and it's not just Trump that's doing this. We've had this idea that he's murdering people in these boats. Well, we had that issue with Obama. They whacked al-Awlaki, who was an al-Qaeda member, an alleged al-Qaeda member, he probably was, and his son, and they were U.S. citizens, and so there wasn't a war. Now they had a authorization to go after al-Qaeda, the main al-Qaeda after 9/11, but then George W. Bush blew it into this worldwide attack on terrorism, which clearly people say, well, you know, he had a resolution. I'm going, if you read the resolution, you're supposed to go over the perpetrators of 9/11, which was al-Qaeda, Afghan and Pakistan, and the people who were harboring the Taliban. But al-Awlaki wasn't in that group, that part of al-Qaeda, and so they whacked him. So Trump is not the first person to do these things, but certainly it is alarming, and there's no war on, so what do you call it? I guess you have to call it murder, because that's what it is. If there's no declared war, then... some of the other wars, as we go along, I go into various domestic, but you see various things. The United States is a democracy, and we have election, and you see almost inevitably that there's that foreign policy revolves around the election, and this is and it also revolves around territorial acquisition, economics, and that thing. And I go through various wars to demonstrate that. One that's really stark is that the story on the public perception of the Cuban Missile Crisis is much different than the actual reality. The public perception is that John F. Kennedy faced down the Soviets and got them to withdraw the missiles from Cuba, the nuclear missiles that they placed there, and that he was a hero because he did that. Well, in reality, he had a secret deal, and this just came out, I don't know, in the last 10 or 15 years, that he also had to get rid of the U.S. missiles, which were on the Russian border in Italy, Jupiter missiles in Italy and Turkey. And he kept that a secret because he was weak, he was perceived as weak before he went into the Cuban Missile Crisis, because he had he had sponsored an invasion of Castro's Cuba that went bad, and he also had been bested at in the Vienna summit by Khrushchev. So it's really stark when you listen to the tapes of Bobby Kennedy and John F. Kennedy, and they're not talking about that. They were saying, well, these missiles in Cuba, you know, they really don't change the balance. We still have nuclear superiority. I mean, we may be all annihilated 15 minutes earlier than we would be normally in any nuclear war, but they admitted that there was no strategic problem with these missiles. And Kennedy says, well, yeah, if I hadn't have said that if they put missiles there, it would be a grave threat to the United States, because I wouldn't have to do anything about it at all. And then they started talking about how he needed to be tough for the upcoming congressional election so that the party would do well in the congressional election. And I'm thinking, wow, if this happens when the world's is hanging in the balance, then you got politics in every national security crisis. And so I think that's very illustrative. So I go through, the history, and there's many very surprising things about a lot of these wars that are not in the we have the historians would agree with a lot of this, but they're pro and con and all this kind of stuff. But the public, there's been a narrative to each one of these wars, and a lot of times the public narrative is not the same as what they're really discussing in academic circles